Chapter 4 Lycanthropy and Lotus. Mac awoke looking through the haze of morning eyes in his waking delirium at a place he did not initially recognize. The room became more familiar after rubbing the Sandland sun from his eyes. It was his little hovel away from home. He looked across the room to see Zebu curled up contentedly on the shelf that he had claimed. Mac rolled the bed covers off of him to the right and dismounted to the left. After a groan realizing he was no longer dreaming, Mac stumbled blurry-eyed to the bathroom. He gained his composure as the warm water from the showerhead cleaned him. He left the bathroom full of steam and smelling of wood and citrus. He dug through his drawers. He had filled them the night before with his belongings. Mac found a loose-fitting set of tied trousers and an open shirt that required tying closed. He put on the same socks he had on yesterday as they were deposited near the bed. Once he was dressed, he tried to raise Zebu from his slumber, a task completed with difficulty. Mac exited the necklace room, hair still slightly wet from his washing, and with a sleepy-eyed Zebu holding onto his shoulder, he emerged into his old bedroom. He then closed the hatch and made it disappear with a crystal around his neck. He looked out the window, and from his years of living in Rosecross he knew that while the rest of the continent of Iplela already had an hour of sunlight, Rosecross still had an hour of darkness left to experience. He could tell by the faint glow across the top of the wall. "All right, time to do this," Mac said to Zebu, who was still fighting the urge to go back to sleep, and he exited the room, descending the stairs. On his way down the landing, he noticed Fang still covered with a blanket but wide awake. Well, someone is eager to get started," Fang said as he pulled the blanket from his bare legs and chest. Mac looked over at the tattoo that Fang had on his neck and shoulders. It was a variant of a tribal moon, and it surrounded the bites that cursed him with lycanthrope on the day Fang saved his life. A large X-shaped scar crossed his chest, and I thought I was covered in fur, Zebu remarked from the table, referencing the graying hair that covered Fang's body. Mac busied himself by pouring some bland corn-based cereal into a bowl and then sprinkling it with sugar. "And I'm supposed to be the monster here," Fang said, noting Mac's tendency to not put milk into his cereal right before pulling his usual shirt over his head. "I hate how soggy and messy it gets," Mac said in between bites of his cereal. He watched Fang pull his trousers on and fasten all the straps of his attire into position, finally finishing by pulling his jacket over his shoulders and fastening his weapon howler into its straps on the back of his jacket. "We should get going to meet the appointment with the Fosters and kill some time beforehand anyway," Fang said, stretching his limbs where the cracking and popping of his joints joined the groan he produced while stretching. "I will be staying here for the time being to catch up on some reading and whatnot." Zebu yawned from the table. He was squatted down, front paws hidden by his own fur, eyes opening and closing in slow, random intervals. "You just want to sleep some more," accused Mac, rubbing Zebu's head as he passed him. "You are," replied Zebu in mock offense, before continuing with, "Buy me a bed while you're out. It will improve my slumber on that shelf of yours," remarked Zebu as he laid his head down on his paws and covered his face with one of his wings. "Sure, buddy," Mac replied, and he and Fang went out the door, making their way back through the dimly lit town, lit by magical blue lanterns that dotted the sides of the path. "Let's go around, okay?" Fang said, setting off not down the tired path through town but towards the eastern wall of Rosecross behind the Malmquist house. They walked up the beginning of the slope that eventually turned into the plateau and circled behind the barn of Gregorio Poisonquoud, a widowed poultry breeder. Originally, the two children, Yarrow and Cadden Poisonquoud, helped around the farm, but the death of their mother Eldora and the presence of Gregorio's new mistress Robin Ward have driven the boys away. This leaves Gregorio to tend to the chickens alone. The chicken coop, containing steaming squawkers, a type of chicken with boiling blood, began to wake up to their presence. The sound of many kettles boiling over emanated from the coop as Mac and Fang hurried their pace to get onto the walking path. Most houses were now lit by candles, and the streets were very much less populated by people due to it being early in the morning. They took a small set of stairs westward carved into the hill to bring them down to the flat floor of the canyon connecting to the walking path. At the bottom of this staircase, they came face to face with Belle Vacca's house. Mac looked up at the window he knew was hers and fixated on it as they walked past. The house was dark, no one was home. Due to them having to set their shop up every morning, they, like other merchants, were very early risers. Fang nodded upward at the guards that were patrolling as a sign of recognition. The guards did patrol at all times, not like a militant state but just as a courtesy to those they protected. It was exceedingly rare to be hustled by a god unless you were doing something genuinely mischievous. Adolescent boys were probably the most common interaction the guards had, mainly from teenage shenanigans taken a touch too far. Civilians had pleasant conversations with the gods. Otherwise, they passed the wash house, which was just starting to open its doors, letting in 3 harassed-looking women laden down with baskets of clothes. The dew from the grass reflected the blue lantern glow into the women's tired yet diligent eyes. One woman in particular pulled along what looked like a barrel, and its side lifted by a metal frame sculpted to fit it, with small brass clockwork dog legs. The legs had a bowed shape to them, probably from the constant use to carry an abundance of clothes. The Steelbreaker General Store was likewise opening its doors. They entered collecting a cut bed for Zebu, and wasted a bit of time to get themselves closer to their agreed appointment. The large shopkeeper Brutus, Oxim's father who granted his son his large size, but has since shrunk with age, thanked them for making sure his boy came home safely the night prior. Fang purchased some additional equipment while he was there. He was chatting with Holly, who was running the tills like normal, after paying while pulling a circular bracelet off of his wrist. He tossed it onto the floor where it widened into a thick metal ring. The innards of this circle did not display the sturdy wooden floor of the room, but a trapdoor behind which was a hole where a ladder proudly rose from it. Following the ladder down was a small storeroom, lined with shelves. Fang crouched down and placed his purchases into one of the upper shelves. He collected the bracelet as he stood it returning to normal, then he replaced it on his wrist. What? You don't see me carrying a backpack worth of stuff. Where did you think I kept it all? Fang replied to the look Mac gave him. Mac just simply shrugged in response. They passed the Macmillan Library on their right. Its windows were dark and cold, except for a small window near the basement of the structure where the family lived, emanating a soft, gentle glow from its panes. Inside the main library, a small orange orb can be seen bouncing and bobbing within a lantern, no doubt held by Oren, looking for any nocturnal pests that would dare damage his precious books. To their left, they saw the houses set into the plateau on the east side of the canyon, raised to allow room for the properties that did not connect to the vertical wall. One such property was a musical instrument shop that sold both the sheet music and the instruments to play them. Their quality was rumored divine, and their prices as equally grand. They turned left off of the main road and into the caravan circle, as the locals called it. The vendors were beginning to set up their stalls in the dimly lit town. Some food vendors were already set up trying to boost their business by catching those who worked nights or early shifts. Mac once again saw her, his crush Belle Vacca, a girl around his age. While Sapphire was a very alluring woman, Belle had a glow about her that always drew Mac's gaze. She was shoulder height to Mac and had a natural beauty about her that Mac could tell would last her entire life. Her long caramel hair was held back by a floral ribbon and further decorated by an intricate lotus clip situated above her right temple. Mac studied her as if he was going to try to paint her from memory alone, as she helped her father set up his stall for the morning. She wore a dark beige top that displayed her lightly tanned shoulders, that was tight around her thin, athletically feminine body. She wore tight shorts that were covered by a brown tool belt containing florist equipment. Her outfit choice was most likely selected to keep her cool, an endeavor not helped by the sticky, humid air from the river in this busy section of the town. Mac watched as Belle moved some heavy-looking plant pots to a table from the wagon her family had transported them in, then affixed a price tag to them. "You must like her, kid," Fang said, smiling as they walked through the market. "How can you tell?" Mac asked. "I'm still fixated on her delicate form." Belle Gal noticed Mac staring at her. Her blue eyes locked with Mac's brown eyes for a second before Mac broke the connection and hurried in the direction of the Fosters, his actions dictated by his nervousness around the source of his affection. I can hear your heartbeat. I can usually tell if someone is lying that way too. Fang explained, keeping pace with the nervous adolescent to the Fosters' business. I've only talked to her a couple of times and made a fool of myself every time. Mac admitted, slumping his shoulders, still focused on her enough to not respond correctly to Fang's words. Kid, I have no advice for you on picking up girls. I got lucky. Fang chuckled to himself. Having finally left the caravan circle, the lanterns began to turn off slowly, no longer needed, because of a soft glow of pink and orange rising over the walls. The sun had finally made its appearance. The fog had started rising from the grass as the morning dew warmed and evaporated, giving the air a nice, moist texture. When they entered the Fosters, Brooke Foster greeted them with flamboyant noises of excitement as he scuttled around the greeting counter, grabbing Mac by the shoulders. Brooke's breath reeked of coffee with a hint of vanilla. I'm so excited by this piece. We are quite proud of our work and I can't wait to see your expression when you try it on. Brooke gleefully squealed while steering him into the drawing room. In the center of the room was the mannequin that matched Mac's proportions exactly and was covered with a cloth, obscuring its contents. Off to the side sat the two brothers Douglas and Otti. Douglas was puffing out of a pipe, filling the room with what smoke did not filter out the window open to the workyard. I wish you wouldn't smoke that wretched pipe around customers, Douglas, prodded Brooke as he entered the room. Well, I have an interview for an apprentice, and I'm trying to keep my nerves down, Douglas said, holding his pipe in his mouth. Mac, here is the underclothes that we would recommend underneath the armor, said Otti, trying to change the subject as he patted a neatly folded set of clothes on the table. You can change behind the privacy screen there. He gestured to a screen Mac could hide his shame behind. Fang positioned himself in a chair underneath a portrait of a very well-dressed and dark-skinned man sitting regally in a high-back chair with the inscription reading, "Creation without passion is meaningless, Stephen Foster." The ghost of this phrase was embodied in his two sons and son-in-law. Thanks, replied Mac, who took the clothes and changed into them behind the screen. Once fully donned, he noticed that the naturally colored shirt he wore was silky and breathable to keep him from sweating, yet had padding like a gambeson without the bulk. The pants he wore were of the same material as the top. The fabric was durable enough to protect him like work clothes, but still light on his frame. Although Mac had nothing to confirm this suspicion outright, he felt as if the clothes were enchanted in some way to aid their purpose. The socks he had on made him feel stable with every step and even gave him a small spring to his jaunt. You are the best seamstress in the world, Brooke, said Mac as he stepped out from behind the screen. Oh, that may very well be so, but our joint efforts are yet to be seen, Brooke replied, blushing and turning the same color as his red suit top. Then he sauntered over to the covered mannequin and pulled the cloth draped over it away with a dramatic flourish. He added noises of splendor and astonishment he felt was necessary while unveiling his newest masterpiece, providing the sound effects with his mouth that he thought the swish of the cloth was severely lacking. Mac set his eyes on his armor for the first time, and he smiled, gobsmacked, staring at the set. I don't know what to say, Mac stammered, walking closer, mouth ajar with awe. Don't say anything, just put it on, boy, Douglas said as he puffed another billow of smoke. Mac put the helmet on the floor gently and removed the armored top over the mannequin's head, and then slipped it over his own. He felt the chainmail shirt base rest and settle as he adjusted himself. He pulled his hands through the chainmail sleeves and then slipped his middle finger into a ring the sleeve was connected to. This was done to keep the chainmail sleeves in position. He then pivoted up the adjustable metal neck guard to cover his neck. He ran his fingers over the thick black leather torso armor that he could tell had metal strands woven into it. It flexed with his movements, as did the metal shoulder guards. They glided smoothly across each other as he moved. He pulled on the full silver leg armor chaps combination and attached them to a wide equipment belt. The armor set felt as if it weighed very little despite its protection, and it hindered him minimally at all. The belt wrapped around his waist, holding up his leg armor. The belt had a row of pouches and loops on it coming together in an intricate buckle. Alongside each of the thighs was a pouch that draped red tassels out of it, each leading to a throwing dot. He sat crouched down next to the helmet and put on his new leather thick-soled boots. He could tell a knife was hidden inside the ankle of each of the boots, alongside a very small secret compartment in each of the shoes designed for lockpicks. Slipping the fingerless gloves over the top of his hands, he then pushed the smooth Roman helmet over his head and noticed where he thought there was an opening to his face was a very thin veil that after a moment he ignored, looking right through it. "That mesh over your face will protect your little eyes from damage, darling," Brooks said proudly. "Also, if you say or know something will happen," instructed Brooke, his hands wringing each other in excitement. Max stands up and looks around, feeling elated and powerful. He looked at his hands, ignoring most of the instruction he was being given. Eventually, he was pulled from his stupor by Fan. "Mac, just say oh no, so Brooke doesn't have a fit," Fan said with a smile, seeing Mac enjoy and appreciate the gift. "Oh, all right, sorry. Oh no," Mac called out, and the helmet split into two and set itself into his shoulder blades. "Wow," Mac said, grinning like a Cheshire. "Most young men don't wear helmets because they think it ruins their looks. So they often abandon it somewhere or never have it on when it counts," Douglas said. "But what really ruins your looks is dying from being stupid like that. So I made it easier to get the helmet off and on. That steel pachyderm leather you're wearing, they naturally have fibers woven into their pelt that are as strong as steel," commented Douglas, waving his pipe around with enthusiasm. "Yes, just use the same command word to put the helmet back on. Now, can we get to my contributions?" Artie remarked impatiently. Artie lifted a cloth on the table, revealing 3 items. 2 were familiar to Mac, however one was not. "You two may want to move," Mac said as he reached his hands out toward the items. Artie and Douglas ducked away from the table as Mac's sword and shield flew to his appropriate hands, his sword in his right and shield to his left. Immediately Mac noticed the grip of the shield had been rewrapped with a sinuous material which was very comfortable and gave him positive feedback as he flipped the grip in his hands for different guards. He noticed that the edges of his shield had been reinforced with a dark metal and the point of the teardrop had been sharpened. Instead of trying to change guards by flipping it in the air like that, hit the button on the end of the handle with your thumb, Artie instructed. "Wow," replied Mac as after he had followed the instructions, the shield rotated 180 degrees, with the point of the teardrop now facing forward instead of back along the arm. He pressed the button again, and it returned to its normal position. "We examined the wear and tear on your shield and surmised that you frequently flip the shield around to use the point as a secondary stabbing weapon and the edge of the curved bit like a brawler," Douglas explained. "We made these changes to assist you in your fighting style, cause in the time it would take you to flip your shield around you can lose your shield." His sword had no differences he could note except being sharpened and polished. Once putting both his sword and shield into the combo holder on his left hip, he walked over and picked up the third object. The large dueling knife felt very comfortable in his hand, nesting perfectly around his grip, curving slightly. The guard was an extended S shape, the curve pointing away from the wielder, beginning on the false edge of the blade. The blade extended the length of Mac's cubit and had a very thick spine. A fluted spike adorned the pommel. If you unscrew that, you can imbue the blade with various properties like poison or oil to light on fire. There's a small depression in the back of the guard you have to press to activate it. You wouldn't want to poison your steak while cutting it, would you? Artie laughed as he watched Mac sheath the dueling knife. Mac walked over to the full-length mirror in the corner and spoke the command to read on his helmet. He twisted and turned, looking at his reflection, feeling his heart swell as he thought of how he would make those that cared for him proud. Once finished admiring his new attire, he turned to the room, bowing, hands in an honorable gesture. "I want to thank you all for your craftsmanship and expertise, and I will do this God no dishonor," Max said humbly. Brooke, who had taken a position at his husband's side, giggled. Oh, he likes it and shows his appreciation so nobly. What a little treat he is. Ottie was playing with a device that had a lens on the front of it. Now strike a pose, Mac. You're going on the wall of satisfied customers, Ottie instructed before pointing the lens at him. Mac unsheathed his sword and set the tip into the floor, folding his hands and the pommel as the lens grew brighter before filling the room with a blinding flash. Ottie immediately set the device down on its back, allowing it to cool down before pulling an image plate out of the slot in the side. The image showed the position Mac was in a few moments ago. The moment of elation was interrupted by the store's bell being stuck as someone entered the door. Oh, more customers, perfect timing. I love displaying finished work as new people come in. It's inspiring, Brooke said, with his usual high energy levels, before skipping out the door. Conversational noises could be heard from the other room as Douglas handed Mac a large bag of things. And here are spare underclothes, undergarments, socks, and some towels, as well as a weapon maintenance kit, spare throwing dots, and some other odds and ends. But remember, you can always send a carrier albatross if you need more. And there is something in there for Zebu as well, Ottie added. Fang took the bag from Douglas. They began walking to the door, which opened before they could reach it. A small mousy teen walked into the room with a nest of blonde hair that was kept back by an orange bandana and a pair of rusty welding goggles. She was very small, no bigger than a 10-year-old child. She was dressed in a provocative tomboyish manner with a grey crop top and long black baggy pants, pockets sewn haphazardly into them. She wore an orange hooded jacket with the zipper left open to reveal her pierced belly and chest, which was large for her shoulder width. With each stride of her thick work boots, she seemed to almost dare some lecture to comment on her body, just so she could knock their teeth out. Her small hands were covered in leather vambraces with fingerless gloves. Silena followed the small teen into the room, her face showing evident surprise to see Mac and Fang there. Silena was wearing a pair of tight fern green shorts that ended above her knees, while a pair of leather shin guards covered the rest of her legs, attached to a pair of brown knee-high boots designed for running through thickets of brush. A skirt of thick brown leather went from the center of her thigh round to the other, parting with each step, allowing free movement of her legs without encumberment. The skirt was covered in pouches of various sizes. A large leather strap sewn in acted as a belt, which split into two smaller belts near the opening. The top buckle was 2 notches tighter than the bottom, probably to keep the skirt on her hips. Wrapped around her stomach was another wide belt closed with an equally wide buckle. This connected to a large barrel bag and her lower back. Underneath, she wore a tight green tank, whose straps were riveted leather and covered her upper torso in leather as well, closely matching her proportions. Small metal pauldrons were attached to the straps covering her small shoulders. Silena had fingerless leather gauntlets that had a diagonal weave pattern on them similar to her sister. Her hands were adorned with rings that, knowing Silena, all had a secondary magical function. Is that your armor set, Mac? Boy, does the kid kit up well, Silena said, scanning over Mac's attire. I'd imagine this is your sister XY. I don't remember her name since I never see her. She's usually cooped up in her room like the child she is, Fang said, looking down at her. I'm 18 for your information, and I'm usually up there 'cause I can't stand the smell of wet dog cicero, the girl said, fire in her eyes and jaw clenched. She was nearly 2 feet shorter than Fang, but her spirit was ready to knock him down to size. You do remember you're staying in my childhood home, right? Fang replied. Avarisville area, it is time for your interview, Douglas said softly, admiring the feistiness of his candidate. Overbehave, I'll meet you at home. I'm going to go with Fang and Mac to the training grounds, as I said earlier, said Silena as she exited the room, but then ducked back around the doorframe, sternly adding, remember, you're supposed to go straight home afterward. You didn't have to follow me here. I can walk by myself, Ova said, stubbornly squaring up with her sister from across the room. If I did that, you would skip the interview anyway, like last time you applied for the jewelry store, Silena said before exiting the room, refusing to hear her younger sister's rebuttal. Ova blew a raspberry at her older sister's disappearing form and turned to speak with both Artie and Douglas about the work she would be doing. Her teenage arrogance slowly left her face as the kindred spirits of makers conversed. She nodded in genuine appreciation to the gentle guidance the hulking men were giving her. Mac headed outside to join Xylena as Fang took care of paying Brooke. Xylena, who was leaning on the building watching the sun finally get its entire circumference over the edge of the canyon, turned to Mac. "Yes, that's my little sister. She's a bit temperamental, and eccentric but very talented. I hope she takes a liking to this place. I know she will fit right in," Xylena said almost apologetically. "Don't worry, XY, she seemed to be hitting it off with the Fosters while I left," Fang said, shoulders dipping before continuing. "I can't believe it cost 25 a cly for everything. I know they do good work, but damn are they expensive. Although I usually get some money back by supplying them with materials. Let me put this stuff in my room and we can head off," Max said, fishing the necklace from his armor and after materializing the hatch threw the bag onto his bed below him. As he closed the hatch, the familiar sound of feathers flapping hit all their ears. Cebu then landed on the signpost and greeted them all. "Mac, Bartholomew's brother Ogden the carpenter would like to make some improvements to your abode. I just have to bring the crystal back to the house for him to work on it. He will be finished before you return home," Cebu said from his position. "You won't be able to open the thing without my hands touching the crystal, otherwise it will return to its socket." Mac replied confused. "There is a way to allow others access to your abode, which is a good idea. In case you are injured, let me show you how to do it," Fang corrected Mac as he walked over to the boy and kitten Hawk. "You take the crystal out of its socket and tap the forehead of the creatures you want to allow access to the abode while saying, 'I allow these beings access to my sanctuary, and we will be allowed to get in and out of our own accord.'" Mac without question tapped Cebu and Fang's forehead while reciting the command phrase, watching the crystal glow green and then returning to normal. He handed the crystal to Cebu. "As the healer, you should probably also include me in that," Xylena said. Mac nodded at his short-sightedness and repeated the ritual on Xylena, rehanding the crystal back to Cebu. "There's a present from the Fosters in the bag for you, and tell Ogden I said hello," Mac instructed while patting his head. Cebu just nodded with his mouth occupied by the crystal and flew due north back to the Ebenrear household. "All right, let's go train," Xylena said with excitement. They marched north once again through the caravan circle, being mercilessly hounded by merchants that were all now completely set up, pushing their wares practically down their throats. "You, short, blonde, and radiant, this dress will bring out your eyes. Adventurers, you should try my miracle salve. I have cut collars in every shape and style, buy one for every hour of the day. Moldable keys. Moldable keys are for sale here. Get through any basic lock without property damage. Moldable keys. I got raw ore here, Uclathil, Pothithil, Kepruthil, Seusium, Sponium, recently mined in the depressed mesa out west. I could have sold my wares in Centralia, but I made the trek for you, dear customer. Warriors, this knife was forged in the great volcanic forges of Bagboulder, yours for only 7 Zuckli." The numerous calls of greedy shopkeepers circled within Mac's mind until eventually it was all one unending whine of consumerism and greed. They escaped to the corner of the circle, Mac's head still spinning with offers and wares that were rammed through his ears. Although he dreaded the next stall they would be passing most of all, the florist stall. Mac had pulled his helmet on to hide from Belle. He didn't want to see her until he was comfortable with himself in his armor, suddenly feeling awkward and stiff at the thought of her. He was worried that as a woman who liked nature, maybe she would not trust a warrior. He strutted proudly of Foss now that the initial giddiness of feeling secure in his armor had left him. He kept his eyes forward and focused and not meeting someone's eyes. So lost in this endeavor he plowed straight into Belle Vaca, who was carrying a tray of clay pots. The pots clattered to the paved path and shattered. Belle and Mac both crouched down to deal with the mess. "Oh no," Mac muttered in nervousness, meaning to say, "Oh no." Belle locked eyes with him after his helmet retreated, and she smiled as she continued to sweep up the pots. Her blue eyes locked with Mac's brown eyes once again, this being the closest he has ever been to her. She smelled sweet like citrus with a mix of an earthy smell that of potting soil. Mac's heart raced, leaving him speechless. "You're that Ebon boy, Mac, right? I remember you. You have the cutest kitten hawk I've ever seen with that short snout of his," calmly inquired Belle, her perfect white teeth peeking behind a soft smile. "Yeah, that's me," I stammered, a red-faced Mac, before being cut off. "My inventory. You're gonna pay for those?" Mr. Vacker yelled from the nearby stall. "I'll pay double their worth for the inconvenience, sir," replied Mac, standing up quickly and darting over and fishing out money from within his pockets. Mr. Vacker declined for the double payment, but Mac harshly insisted, leaving the second payment on the table against Mr. Vacker's wishes. Mac then scuttled off, giving one last smile back at Belle and catching up with the rest of the group. "So how did it go?" Silena asked. She smiled with a knowing grimace. Mac had seen a flash of green crest over her shoulders as he returned to them. "Horrible. I broke some of their inventory and knocked her over," Mac replied sheepishly, hands in his pockets. "Broke stuff, did you? Did you at least pay for it?" chuckled Fawn, his hands interlaced behind his head as he strutted down the road. "Yeah, I paid double what I broke for the inconvenience. It was my idea to do that," Mac answered. "Well, that was a sweet gesture. I'm sure she appreciated that," Silena mused with a polite smile. "No, he didn't. I left the extra money on the counter and ran off," Mac replied, not hearing what she said properly. This conversation carried them the whole way out of the market circle. Before hitting the main street, which was starting to become bustling, they turned left towards the main bridge to the west of them. They walked on the right side of the large stone bridge flanked by 4 square towers at its corners. This bridge, which everyone knew, was only so big and large as a statement piece. They already had smaller functional bridges spanning the thinner parts of the river that divided Rosecross, so it made very little sense otherwise to spend funds and resources to build a large intricate structure spanning the widest part of the river, which was the size of a large pond. While this basin was a good way away from the entrance, the large bridge could be seen elegantly in the distance upon arrival. Along the side of the wide bridge were very small merchants who had their wares laid out in baskets for bulk or on carpets for individual items. The faces and wares of these peddlers changed frequently, as most of them were traveling merchants trying to make a living on the road trading goods. A small group of 6 guards manned the bridge, usually pacing back and forth, the raised platform of the bridge giving them a good view of a large area, including the market circle, to spot thieves. One such guard was asking a very dirty and disheveled merchant, who smelled of urine, to stop spreading his wares on the walking path and stick to the sides where it was allotted. His ways could only be described as the garbage of a madman. The god leaned on his man-catcher spear as he spoke to the man politely. Mac turned his head south and saw the twin gates to Rosecross divided on either side of the river and built into god houses that were themselves built into the side of the canyon. One of these gates was strictly an entrance while one was strictly an exit. This allowed the gods to control the flow of traffic and keep the villagers safe by keeping track of comings and goings. Wanted posters covered the inside of the god houses. A large metal grate covered the river, allowing people to cross it without having to go the whole way to the big bridge to turn around. On the other side of the open-out gate, Mac can see the path slope downward along with the river flowing down the mountain. Once crossing the bridge, the party was met with a large sunken courtyard filled with stone planters and benches. The courtyard was brimming with people crossing and weaving around each other. Most were dressed more dignified than those that did manual labor. Some very well-dressed men entered the marble-clad bank, whilst a very dignified woman left its halls. Behind a rather intricate fountain lay the town hall with its path circling its structure. The town hall is where courts were held for crimes, the residence of the acting minister, and in the 3-story basement, the jail was located. Although they overcompensated when building the jail, only the first of the sublayers was partially used, as the town being relatively new in the grand scheme of things, crime had not grasped its streets yet. The town hall was a good place for congressional meetings and whatnot. One such meeting was scheduled to be taking place soon from what Bartholomew had told Mac. This meant that ministers from the other 9 cities on Ipella were all in or on their way to Rosecross. From their position at the peak of the bridge, Mac saw a burly bearded giant sitting on a chair built especially for him underneath a canopy. The man was 15 feet tall and waiting patiently for some carpenters to finish building a small shack for him to stay in during the conference. And I thought Oxheim was big. Mac said to himself, he's a giant Mac and the minister of Noria. He is known for arriving early. The meeting is not for a good couple of days. Silena explained after hearing Mac's comment. Yeah, unlike Soknapikol, that little imp is always late. He blames the fog around Buxton, but he's just having a laugh. Fang replied with a smirk. Who? Mac asked. Sorry, the minister of Buxton up in the northwest of the continent. The best school of illusion magic. Around the worst pubs too. Can't relax with everyone trying to scum you. Fang explained. Having to pass adjacent to the bank, Mac laid his eyes on the minister of Rosecross Armadeus Valheim, a very portly yet dignified-looking man, his greying blonde moustache waxed to perfection. He was happily greeting a woman who had long jeweled braids by kissing her hand. Mac had guessed correctly. She was a leader from another settlement across Ipella. Where is she from? Cassitone. Looks tropical. Mac asked Silena, who was very knowledgeable and polite about it. Cassitone was an archipelago district southeast of the Gulf of Candor, which itself was on the west side of the continent. No, she is the ministress of Falport. The ministress of Cassitone is a mermaid, Silena replied. They followed the long path to the training ground at the westernmost point of Rosecross adjacent to the woods. They saw the college off in the distance, a complex of buildings dedicated to the study of magic and the world around them. This complex had 2 study buildings, a dorm house and the massive college library, all connected by courtyards and contained inside of a gated brick wall. The iron-wrought gate had no keyhole or a handle, just a plate containing the bust of a shrewd owl. Mac tried to enter the college once, but couldn't get past the gate. The owl seemed to be the arbiter of passage he could not sway. Once passing the drives for the college, the area quickly dissolved into a more rural area, including the farm where they raised ophiodons for dairy and meat. The large creatures whined at them through their horns while coming up to the tall wooden fence. The creatures approached but did not dare touch the electrified fence. The fence consisted of posts connected with barbed wire, and little yellow glass spheres adorned the posts, each one pulsing with dull power. They followed the road further until they reached its end. A large bunkhouse sat at the end of a rough dirt patch that was part of the barracks that were built into the walls surrounding Rosecross. This was done to make a genuine protective ring around the settlement, as even a mage who could phase through rock would have to go through the barracks to sneak into the city. And in front of the building that extended from the wall was a large dirt patch that consisted of the training grounds. A small obstacle course was off to one side to practice agility, with some offshoots of things to practice on. A sunken archery pit was situated to the eastern side, although not everyone using the archery pit was using a bow and arrow. One notable soldier was throwing knives into the target in quick succession. Some sparring rings dotted the area, some larger, some smaller. The whole area was encompassed by a lock fence that some children usually sat on to watch the soldiers, guards, and hunters train. So is everyone going to be meeting us here? Mac asked before being cut off by a deep bellow. That will be Oxheim. Hopefully he's sober. Fang said, starting to jog into the clearing. The training grounds were populated with many people practicing various combat skills, from the uniformed soldiers and guards practicing drills to the more freelance fighters honing their individual techniques. Oxheim, dressed in his combat attire, had a deep red shirt and brown pants underneath his thick dense armor. He had massive pauldrons on each shoulder connected by a chest and backplate. While thick, they were constructed in such a way as to allow a full range of movement, and one of the pauldrons carried Oxheim's family crest, 2 broken ingots crossing inside a wagon wheel. The other bore the same ball head tattoo Oxheim had on his shoulder. Chainmail made out of the thickest rings Mac had ever seen in his life connected the shoulders to Oxheim's gauntleted hands, with warm red leather gloves completing them. Around his waist were equally thick thigh and waist armor designed as metal chaps effectively held together by a belt about a foot wide. The thigh armor connected to massive boots and shin armor. Mac could tell that while the set looked intricate and impossible to put on oneself, it wasn't, boiling down to bottoms and a connected top. This could probably be able to be donned in under a minute when needed. A viscid Salik completed this three-piece set and kept his mane of hair in check. His impressive flowing beard was contained inside a leather tube, keeping the large mass of hair contained near his sternum. The tube was closed. On one end the other had little claws that combed into his beard for stability. The outside of the brown leather had dashes of red color in patterns, and within those patterns contained spikes, resembling a flail, thus making it not a wise idea to pull on Oxheim's beard. This little contraption no doubt had a story for its creation. When he moved, the tube stayed oddly still like a sluggish pendulum, indicating it had some type of enchantment on it. Oxheim was furiously slicing locks that after 5 seconds reformed from being cut. He was not letting up on his practice opponents one bit. His eyes glowed a deep blood red, illuminating some of the opponents he was eviscerating through his viscid sight. The thing that shocked Mac the most was the size of Oxheim's weapon. The hammer-axe blade combo was the size of Mac in height, and the hammerhead face was as wide as a standard buckler. Oxheim manipulated this massive weapon effortlessly with a wide stable stance. "Bear, give it a rest, where are the others?" Fang shouted at the large irate-looking man. Oxheim turned to the sound of Fang's voice growling, teeth bayed bestially, his eyes completely obscured by a mist of deep blood crimson emanating from his eyes. His face was contorted into an expression of pure wrath. He locked eyes with Fang, looking like he was going to charge just before his eyes returned to a jovial visage and his face softened to a light-hearted smile. He situated the massive blade on his shoulders before laughing deeply. "Fang, my old friend, glad you're here," Oxheim boomed before continuing to scratch his chin. "I don't know where the others are," he said, looking around before settling his eyes on Mac, who had since taken his helmet off while talking to Belle, having failed to hide from her. Oxheim lowered his arms and kneeled to Mac. He groveled like a squire to a king. "My humblest apologies, Mac. Please excuse my drunken behavior last evening. While it is not the first time we met, it was still a bad first impression. I remember when you were just a little tight we rescued." Oxheim trailed off and extended his massive hands to shake Mac's. Mac wrapped his whole hand around Oxheim's index finger, which was as thick as his sword hilt, and shook that instead. "No worries, Oxheim, you had a lot on your mind," Mac said, staring up at the impressive man. Oxheim's reply was cut off by the sound of leathery wings beating as a jet-black figure landed behind Mac 3 paces away. Well, the fruit definitely seems to have matured, but we will see if it was plucked before it was ripe," growled Soko as his wings disappeared into his shoulder blades, his vest having holes to allow this to happen. "Now where's Talik, Soko?" Fang asked, scanning the pitch. "Oh, he's over there beating the snot out of a test dummy with the same strike over and over," Soko said, then tried to imitate Talik's slow canter. "I fear not the man that has practiced 1,000 kicks, but the man who has practiced one kick 1,000 times," he said, laughing a little. "How about we all spar to show Mac what we can do?" Fang suggested. "Oh, I won't be sparring today, just some strength training to remove the vice from my body," replied Oxheim as he walked over to a large rock that had these words carved into it: "Oxheim's boulder, no touch." This rock was the size of 3 cows pressed together and probably very dense. "It's getting too light," Oxheim remarked, then walked to the canyon wall, pulled a chest-sized chunk from the wall, and carried it over to his boulder. He steadied himself, and then began to press the rock into the boulder, which slowly decided to meld with it and join its mass. Satisfied with his magical handiwork, Oxheim began lifting the boulder again, remarking, "That's more of a challenge. I'll be practicing my archery," Silena remarked, opening the wide drawstring pouch on her leather skirt. Fishing her hand in way deeper than the bag should have allowed, she pulled out an intricate violin that should not have fit into the bag it came from. As she walked away, she unfolded it quickly into a longbow with one hand. She pulled some arrows out of her quiver previously empty on her shoulder. Each arrow seemed to grow to her hand as she reached for it. Mac was impressed by the amount of gear she had and how she used their granted gifts so naturally, almost elegantly, like they were a part of her from birth. She steadied herself in front of her target, one of many in the archery pit. One of the many rings she had, and her fingers showed its purpose. The one on her right index finger acted as an archery release. Her first 3 arrows hit so close to each other in the target the fletching looked like a rough flower. Talik is busy. So how about you, Soko? Mac asked instantly. Soko pulled a cigar out of his pocket and set it in his mouth. Mac noticed a small red tattoo of a flame on his thumb. Soko put the cigar into the flame tattoo, and when he pulled it away it was lit. No, mate, you don't want to spar with me. There won't be enough time to heal your broken mind before we depart. Soko replied with a laugh. He took his vest off and allowed it to flop back where it was fastened to his pants. He walked over to some other wooden practice dummies and took a long drag on his cigar before snuffing it out and placing it back into a cigar case. He then leaned back like a creature would burst through his chest, as 9 sword hilts formed from his body. He drew 2 with his hands, and the other 7 with tendrils that formed from his body. He danced and twirled, never letting up his merciless assault on the dummy. Put this on, instructed Fang as he handed Mac a bracelet and stepped into the sparring ring, placing an identical one on his wrist. Any reason? Inquired Mac. While he had questions, he still followed orders. Once he closed the clasp on the bracelet, his body was enveloped in a dull blue, as was Fang's. He now saw the other people in the sparring matches were cloaked in the same blue hue. Those bracelets complete the enchantment of the training grounds. It allows those using them to train with their own weapons against fellow soldiers without getting hurt. It will be easier if I show you draw your sword and run me through. Go ahead, Fang said, standing as if welcoming the strike. Well, okay then, Mac said, trusting his uncle completely but still confused. He took his sword and lunged forward, pressing the tip of his blade into Fang's stomach, and it sailed right through it but felt as if he had stabbed him. Fang stood smiling despite a grimace. Mac pulled the sword away and saw it was not coated in blood, nor did blood pour onto the ground. I'm still confused, Mac said, dropping the tip of his blade to rest on the ground. You'll understand, Fang said as he raised his weapon and slashed Mac across the chest. Arg, grunted Mac. His hand flew to his chest to trace the line of attack. Nothing bone dry. You still feel some pain, as feedback helps with training to not be completely invincible. This type of magic only works within the confines of the training grounds, and if both participants are wearing these bracelets, Fang explained as he stopped his spin from his slash. He looked picturesque. Now let's have a small duel, okay? First let me show you my transformed state, Fang said with a smirk as he closed his eyes to begin the transformation. Fang's body morphed into his lycanthropy form. This change happened over the course of 2 seconds. First, his salt and pepper hairs started to coat his body. Then his nose and mouth formed together into a wolf's muzzle while it elongated, and the scruff on his chin stayed long to mirror his goatee. His ears shifted up his head and grew, sticking out from underneath the mane of salt and pepper hair, which he kept while transformed. The ears somewhat contained the mess of hair as his purple headband disappeared completely, besides a woven purple leather cord that appeared around the base of his hair. He grew taller by 6 inches to 6 foot 4 inches. His clothes and armor shifted to suit his new body, the sound of fabric tearing curiously absent from the air. His foot elongated to that of a canine that walked upright, ending in a paw. His boots split and dissolved, becoming thick anklets wrapping around his canine legs. His vest jacket strained against the broadening form of the transforming state but grew with it. His pants opened softly to allow for a spiky wolf's tail to sway from the base of his spine. His furry arms shifted joints enough to be used to both run on all fours and act like a human's arms. His hands gained paw pads on the inside of his palm and fingers, then retractable claws situated themselves at his fingertips. Fang hunched forward as his spine shifted to accommodate a creature that spent equal time upright as well as on all fours. As his transformation ended, Fang smiled, flashing his interlocking dog teeth. Mac noticed the scar that removed part of Fun's eyebrow manifested as a missing patch of fur on his upper face. His eyes, while bestial in shape, still retained the glow of sentience. There we go, now we can fight. The goal for today is for you to get an idea of how we fight so you can work together with us, Fang said. His voice was deeper and had a more pronounced growl than normal. Wait, how did your clothes change? Did you cast a spell or what? Mac asked as he paced a circle around his uncle, peeking over his raised shield and leaving the false edge of the blade resting on the bottom edge of the shield. Quite a good neutral stance. The Fosters are one of the few people on the planet that can make magically transforming clothes, Fang replied, tracing his ground as well, staring Mac down as he was walking on 3 legs, holding Howler in the 4th behind him. Fang struck first, lashing forward with his teeth, diving up Mac's legs. Mac dodged with a roll and got up with indignation. Are you trying to infect me? Mac asked angrily, returning to his god. No, of course not. Lycanthropy can only be transmitted during the 24 hours surrounding the full moon, and for awakened lycans such as myself, only by choice. It's the unawakened that transmit with every bite, Fang replied as he steadied himself the same way as before. Mac nodded in reply, reassuming his stance. Fang made his move quickly. He hooked Howler around Mac's shield and began to pull. Mac slid his sword along the shield and then tried to knock the spear away from him. Fang turned his blade to hook Mac's sword and controlled the weapon briefly, making sure the sword could not strike him. Fang closed in, grabbing Mac's shield with his claw and pulling it aside. He then released Mac's sword with a twist of his wrist and stabbed Howler directly into Mac's chest around the shield. Damn, that hurt, Mac yelled as he fell to the floor in pain and surprise, dropping his weapon. First off, good God, good footwork, and good planning, but don't fight so defensively. If your opponent is fighting to kill and you're not, you will die, plain and simple, Fang explained, offering a paw to help Mac to his feet. Mac accepted it with his now empty dominant hand. What's the point of a shield if not fighting defensively? Mac asked, being pulled to his feet and summoning his sword to his hand. Just because you blocked your opponent's weapon once doesn't mean it's over. You have to follow through, deflect or parry, turn your defense into an offense, and don't just statically block, instructed Fang. Fine, let's go again, Mac spouted, readying himself again. They resumed their distant circular waltz until Mac bolted inward, sword forward held in both hands. Fang entangled his blade with his spear, then moved his maw to bite at Mac. Mac then pressed the button on his shield grip to rotate it straight into the side of Fang's head. He whelped when struck as the shock of such a surprise maneuver left Fang unbalanced. Mac took the opportunity to kick out Fang's legs and further took the opportunity to plunge his sword downward into Fang's gut to finish him off. There we go, that's the spirit, congratulated Fang through a grimace. Now get that blade out of me so we can continue. Sorry, replied Mac as he pulled his blade from his uncle's stomach and stepped back to allow him to get up. Fang sprung himself to his feet from his back and approached Mac, weapon drawn. That was tricky, kid, and underhanded. I like it. You've improved since our little play fights when you were little, Fang mused with a toothy smile, before beginning another of many exchanges they partook in over their training session, the last of which ended with them both sprawled on their backs, taking each other down simultaneously. You know I'm moving slower than normal for training purposes, right, kid? Fang said. Sure you are. Is that what old people use as an excuse? Replied Mac. They both laid on their back looking up at the darkening sky, laughing over the exchange. The exchange was interrupted by the abode crystal flying through the air and fitting itself into the torque situated around Mac's neck. I guess that means we should head home, Mac surmised, sitting up from the ground. Fang and Mac said their farewells to the rest of Troop 4, then made their way back to the Ebenrear household, cutting straight through the woods due east, passing the Morrissey household once they rejoined the path. They walked over the bridge that Mac once pulled his cot over, which acted as a water purification plant. This is where the council poured the clean water from when filling the town's water tanks. Upon return, they saw no sign of Ogden, Bartholomew's older brother. Not even a toolbox left behind, only a nice hearty dinner on the table for them. Ogden didn't stay for dinner, Mac asked as he washed his ungloved hands in the sink. Conversation blossomed immediately as they surrounded the table. No, he said he was busy. He had a date tonight, Claire explained. Good hope that madman settles down. He drowns himself in work, Bartholomew said. He's the fastest carpenter I have ever seen, so he deserves some pleasure, Fang said. And what about you, Cicero? Have you had your eyes on any lady yet? Clay teased. Actually, yes, I'm damn close to marrying her, replied Fang. Who is it then? Claire said, leaning in to inquire further. She enjoyed gossip, not in a malicious way, just one of the trappings of small towns she enjoyed. If you say you are marrying adventure or something non-physical like that, I will slap you. Oh, trust me, my dear nosy older sister, she has flesh. Lots of it, in fact. Some would say even ample, said Fang, lifting his glass to drink to punctuate his implication. A stifled giggle came from Mac and Zebu at the joke. Men, sneered Claire, annoyed by the influence her wild younger brother was having on her adoptive child. The dinner finished without any further incident, and everyone went about their evenings, doing whatever tasks they would normally do to calm down to slumber. We still have a couple of days to train you before we depart, Fang said, smirking, resting a hand on Mac's shoulder as Mac began to climb the stairs to his room. So rest well, and we will start again in the morning. With that, he allowed Mac to go up to his room, where he entered his abode, noting the changes done to it. These included a flap cut into the bottom of the door, a platform for Zebu to use the hatch, and an ice box in the corner along with prep tables. Mac placed Zebu's new cut bed onto the shelf, he claimed, Zebu excitedly entering it. Mac disrobed and fell, exhausted, onto his bed. The added sluggishness from his meal almost prevented him from covering himself with the blankets.